Greetings hobbyists, this is Artisans of Wool. And this is Ethan. And today we're going to show you how you can 3D scan a little human for 3D printing. So pretty much every time I've done a 3D scanner review, I've been asked how to do this, and obviously it's a bit tricky without a baby. So this video's been 9 months in the making, and never let it be said that I don't put my whole heart into this channel. So what I'm going to cover is how to actually do the 3D scanning and get the best results, what you need to do in the processing stage to make sure that your results look as good as possible, and then some little additions we can do at the end to make things like this plinth that give a really nice setting for our 3D scan. But first of all, we need to cover what 3D scanners to use, and I need to start with a really important safety aspect that you need to be aware of before you decide to do this. So for this video, I'm going to be using the revopoint Inspire 2 because I think it's the most reasonably priced scanner out there that's going to allow you to do this. But the important part is that it is an IR, that's an infrared laser scanner. So it doesn't matter what scanner you use as long as it is an infrared scanner. And the reason for that is there are other scanners out there like blue light scanners, and they are quite dangerous for getting in people's eyes, and I really wouldn't want them near a child. And there are a range of infrared scanners out there, for example the Pop 3 Plus or the Morocco. Now you'll notice that I'm focusing on scanners from revopoint, and there's a couple of reasons for that which we'll go through and you'll see as we start using the software. Bar the safety concerns, the most important thing to bear in mind as you pick a scanner is to get one that can work mobily. That means that it doesn't have to be directly connected to your computer. This can happen in one of two ways. As you just saw with the Inspire 2 and the other revopoint scanners, they can just connect to your computer by providing a Wi-Fi that you connect to, and then you can open up your new project. Alternatively, you could have a scanner that connects directly to your phone. The Inspire 2 can do that as well, but it does mean that your scanning will be a little bit slower. But it does mean that you can directly view your scan as you're doing it on your phone. What's great about the revopoint software is that you can get the best of both worlds, connecting your scanner to your computer remotely via Wi-Fi, but also having that mirrored to your phone so you get all the power of your computer plus your mobile phone screen as you do your scan. Next, as long as your scanner has it, I'd set your depth exposure to automatic, as you're unlikely to get perfect lighting when you're scanning a small child. Which brings me to my next hot tip: do it when the child's asleep, otherwise you're never going to get this working successfully. And the reason for that is that 3D scans work off of the points that you're measuring, not changing position. And to help with that, you'll notice that I'm scanning quite a lot around Ethan, and I've put him on a bed and I've intentionally wrinkled up the bed covers so that it has more points to fix on. What this means is that if Ethan does any tiny little movements like bunches up his hands or moves his legs, which he does in this scan but only slightly, the scanner will have those clean reference points of the folds of the fabric, and the revopoint software will deal with the issue later on as I'll show you. Now this can only be small movements, but it is really helpful. And with that in mind, I'm really consciously trying to scan each element of Ethan only once, and then going back to the area around him to get that fixed point, so that we don't get any overlapping geometry where he might have moved. And this means that this is going to be a pretty quick scan, which is more effective. But it does cause some potential issues. The biggest one that I've got, and probably you might not, is that Ethan, being half Filipino, has got very dark hair. And very dark objects do not scan particularly well, if at all. Now, the Inspire 2 does have a way of scanning dark objects, but I believe that's not eye safe, so I'm not going to use it. But again, the revopoint software will deal with this issue for us, including any other holes that we might not have got perfectly to as we're scanning quite quickly. So with this scan now done, we've got what we call our point cloud. If I zoom in, you can see this is lots of little dots that are overlapping each other or next to each other, and that's going to create our 3D scan or our 3D file. And you'll notice that this isn't perfect. We've got these little bits of extra information here, especially around the hands. I'm assuming Ethan moved slightly as we did this, and we get little extra bits here on places like legs. And look, you can see here he blatantly has moved his leg from a slightly higher position there and has moved it back a little bit. And you can see that. So he's moved this leg at some point. And even asleep, this is almost unavoidable. So what we're going to do is sort our way through this scan. And this is where the revopoint software becomes really, really useful. Again, you can use any scanner that's an infrared scanner, but this is why I recommend the revopoint software, because a lot of other scanning software gives you this one-click option and you don't have much control. Whereas we're going to have a lot of control over this because we're going to do this point by point, working from left to right, and this is going to do everything for us. So our first thing is to fuse this into a point where it's going to be a bit more usable. And what this is going to do is it's going to take all of these points, these little dots, and work out, well, in some places there's two dots that are really close to each other, and we don't need those. So this is where we get this point distance. Now we could set these distances to be quite large, like up to 2 millimeters. I generally find something between 0.4 and 0.5 for a living thing is quite a good option, because realistically there's just not that much detail. We don't need to go much higher than that. If this was something that was not organic and you wanted to get the perfect point on a corner, we might drag this all the way down to like 0.1. Also, bearing in mind that we're going to 3D print this and we're probably going to have to scale this down, this will be fine. So let's click apply and we can see how this looks. And what's good about this is we can always just go back and do this again at a different point distance if we think we need to. Now, the other reason that we're going to want to do this is because it's going to help speed up our computer. And there's going to be a couple of points where we're going to do things that's going to make it easier for our computer to process. And how far you go on this is really going to depend what sort of computer you're working on. But there's no point leaving this at a really high number if you don't need to. So I'll split that up, but in reality that took about a minute. Now you can see we've still got about 3.4 million points here. So this is still pretty detailed, but I'll leave it there for now and we'll see how this goes. Next, we're going to try and get rid of some of the points that might be causing problems. I'm trying to see an example here. Okay, so where we said the leg moved, we've got some points that sort of overlap here. You can see this line of dots just there above the main bit of the knee, which is where the leg probably was at one point. So what we're going to do is click isolation and detect, and it's going to detect all of these points that don't really line up with the majority of our mesh, and you can see how that's worked out. Click apply and it's going to get rid of those points. Overlap does a similar thing, so we're just going to detect that. I think it's detecting things in a different way. I'm going to be perfectly honest, I don't know enough about this, I just know that it works. So we're going to do that and then click apply, and then importantly we're going to click smooth. Now the reason for that is that this scan is, well, very impressive considering this is the cheapest scanner that we get from revopoint. But you can see here we've got the texture of the clothes that Ethan's wearing, and I don't need that. It's definitely not going to come out in a 3D print, and if our 3D printer assumes that as being a level higher, we might get a whole extra layer here which is going to look, well, really grainy in the print. So I'm actually going to take that off. So we're going to click smooth and leave it exactly how it is, see how this looks, and then we'll give it another go afterwards if we need to. And no, I think that is perfectly fine. You can see it's taken out most of that texture, which is good. Now you can also see here, we've got these little holes here, and that's because I probably should have scanned it a bit better. You can see here, I probably scanned it from maybe this angle here, and it didn't get that part. I should have come to here as well, but we were scanning quickly, and that's why I like the revopoint software. It's going to deal with a lot of these problems. So what we're going to do is click simplify. This is going to reduce the information in our mesh, and it's set at 40%, and that's probably going to be fine. I'm not sure we'll even notice a difference in the overall quality here. Let's click apply and see what happens. And yeah, did you notice much of a difference? Because I certainly didn't. In fact, let's do that one more time and see if that still works out okay. Yeah, I'm going to leave it about there. And you can see now we're down to about 1 million points, something much more manageable. Now this is the point where we're going to mesh this into something that becomes 3D printable. Now we can leave it as fast mesh and then we get a lot of options to select things, but I'm going to go quite lazy and go for high quality. And I know that sounds odd to say that that's lazy, but what this does is this gives us an option to auto fill in holes. Now if this is off, you could just click it on and we have this ratio here, and sometimes you want this really low down and then it means that you leave some holes that you can then fill in yourself. And sometimes you want this quite high. We'll leave this at 30% and see what this does. Now, what I will say is I'm dealing with the worst case scenario here. Ethan is too young for me to start putting talcum powder on his head so that I can get his hair, which is a bit of a shame, but everything else is going to fill in really nicely. We might just end up with some minor issues on these very big gaps. I mean, look, this is a really big gap for this software to deal with. So let's click apply.
And you can see we've got all those gaps filled in really, really nicely by the software. It's dealt with all of those shadows that we hadn't got. It's worked really, really well. Really happy with this. Now, this is where we're going to have a slight issue. You can see this has slightly exaggerated the curve of Ethan's head there. That doesn't work. Okay, and here, not great either. So we're going to have to deal with this in some way. And what I'm going to do is use some free software later to deal with this. In reality, if you have a child with blonde hair or without very dark hair like Ethan's got, this probably isn't going to be an issue. But we're going to use that other software anyway to try and make this a much nicer print by the end of it. So not really going to add an extra stage. So let's go to isolation. We're going to detect again because sometimes we find some extra points. Click apply. I'm not sure there was much there to do. Now fill holes is what you could have done here when we did our mesh, is rip this down really, really low, and then it would have left some holes that weren't filled in, and then we could choose how we filled them in manually there. That is perfectly manageable and something we could do, but I don't think it's really needed. We could also smooth this at this stage, but I don't think it's worth doing. Normally I handle everything earlier on, but sometimes you'll find things you want to smooth. For example, here, if you see where we had those little holes, this is just a tiny bit grainier than we'd really want. But I don't want to smooth the whole of the scan at this point. I don't think it's really needed. So what I'm going to actually do here is we've got at the side a smooth brush. Again, very little other software has this. We can fiddle around with what this looks like in terms of how big it is. But I'm just going to quickly just drag over this. I often use a sort of tappy motion. Just something there. And we've smoothed that out. So I've got rid of that texturing that was there. I don't think anything else is going to really need this. And importantly, even with all this smoothness, I've got Ethan's expression really nice and clear. Great. So we could simplify again. And again, we can have a look at what this looks like. So we've got it at 40%. Let's click apply and see if this makes any difference in a way that's going to be a concern to me. And I, once again, have not noticed a difference here, but we've brought down our vertices and polygons. You'll notice this is now in vertices and polygons, not in points, and that really hasn't made much of a difference to me at all. Let's click apply one more time and see how this looks, because every time we do this, it's going to make it easier for our computer to handle when we bring this into our other program later. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I think this is looking really smooth. Let's try one more time. Yeah, let's leave it there. I think that's easily enough detail. I'm not noticing any changes, so we'll see how this works out. At this point, we can export it, and we're just going to export our mesh model. We can choose to have either a PLY, an OBJ, or an STL format. I'm going to go for an OBJ just because it's what I'm used to using, and I'm going to delete this and call this Ethan 3 months, and then click save. We can open the file at that point, and we've got this as our OBJ. Now at this point, we need to bring this into a program to turn this into something that's 3D printable, because at the moment, this is not a solid object. If we've got someone standing, like a head, we can cut this off at the neck and it will turn it into a solid object, but for someone laying down, unless we scan the whole bed, that's going to be a problem. So I'm going to use a program called Blender. So if you go to blender.org, you can just come to where it says download Blender for free. You can also download it in other versions, so if you've got a Mac, you can use that. But Blender is a free bit of software, and it's what I specialize in. It's what I generally like to use for my 3D modeling. So this is what Blender's going to look like when you come into it, with the exception that yours is going to be a grey color like this. I prefer mine in a red, so I've got this set as red. Do not worry about that. It's totally unnecessary. It's just that I spend quite a lot of time in Blender, and having this really stark contrast I find annoying for my eyes. What I'm going to do is hit X to delete out this cube once I've clicked on it. So just click on it, X, and then delete. And we're going to bring in our file of Ethan, or whatever you've scanned. So let's just drag that in, click Import Wave OBJ, and then if we click on our title here, you can see it in this top right hand panel, hit the decimal place on my number pad, and with that we've got our Ethan. Now you'll notice there's a slight issue here of us not being able to see everything all in one go. So let's fix that. But before we do that, let's quickly talk through some Blender basics. Holding down your middle mouse button allows you to rotate around, scrolling in or out, zooms in or out, and holding shift and your middle mouse button allows you to move side by side. That's all we're going to need for this bit. Now let's deal with this part where some of it disappears. And that's because Blender has a function where it clips off certain bits, because otherwise you might have too much to see in one go and that would slow everything down. So if we just hit N, we bring out this thing called the End panel, and I'm going to go to View and change this end clipping point, just add in an extra 0 and that'll be fine. Next, let's hit N again to get rid of that, and we're going to move Ethan so that he's a bit more in the correct angle. So we're going to use that gimbal. I'm going to come to my side just here, so I hit on the X, but you could click on other ones. Oh look, you can see like the other side of this. That looks weird. Anyway, so we'll come to the side and we're just going to click on him and R to get him sort of flat. And then we're going to come to the Y and then do the same thing. Now what we could do is quite intentionally, if we come here, have him slightly lean towards us if we wanted to. That might be nice. Entirely up to you. Then we're going to bring in a cylinder and we're going to cut out this surround. So we've got something that looks a little bit more, well, nice and neat. So I'm just going to Shift A, Mesh. I'm going to bring in a cylinder. And this cylinder is, well, teeny tiny at this point. So what we're going to do is make this bigger, and we're going to do this in this menu. If you don't have this menu, it's just down here. Just click on it. I'm going to up the radius, just click on it and move to the side. And we'll do the same thing with depth. And if you see this at this point, it's a bit more faceted. And we can change this with the vertices. I'm just going to type in like 200. And that'll be nice and smooth. Next, let's look from above. So I'm going to hit the Z. And we're going to move this around, position it, and get it to a more interesting shape. And you can see mine's got a blue outline. Yours is going to probably have a whitey, orangey sort of color, a pale orange. So I'm just going to hit G, which is grab, to move it to more centered on Ethan. I'm going to S to scale it up to sort of encompass most of him. And then I'm going to make it into an oval by hitting S. So we did that a second ago. S is scaling, and then choose an axis. So I'm going to hit Y. If I have a look at the gimbal that we looked at earlier, that's going to elongate it in a sort of a right direction. And then I'm just going to R to rotate this round. Okay, let's just G that to sort of center that up a bit. Maybe S to scale it down a little bit more. And that's looking pretty good. So I'm quite happy with that. Now, we will deal with the hair that I have an issue with. You probably won't unless you've got a child with very dark hair, but just in case you do, we'll solve everything. But at this point, we need to just G and Z this up so that we're covering all of Ethan. Now, if this isn't wide enough, if yours, for example, looks like this, it's really thin, just hit S and then Z to make it wider and then click. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say to Blender, cut everything out that isn't contained within the cylinder. And to do that, we use something called a Boolean. So let's click on our shape. We're going to click on this thing called the modifier panel, click add modifier, and I'm just going to type in Boolean, or at least part way, and then click Boolean. We want to do something called an intersection, which means just keep the things that intersect. And where it says object, I'm going to click this pipette and then click on the cylinder. Now this will take a couple of seconds to think about it, but there we go. We've cut out everything that's not the cylinder. Now if this doesn't work, just try clicking between exact to float or back again, and that will normally work. One of them will work. In this instance, both of them work for me. Once we've done that, we don't need the cylinder anymore, so let's click on that. Then we'll click H to hide it, and then we're going to click on Ethan, and we're going to have a look and say, yes, I think we're happy with this. So we're going to come to our modifier, click there, and then click Apply to say, yes, we're happy with this. Now we need to give this some thickness, because at the moment, there is no volume to this, which means there's nothing to print. It's just an infinitely thin line that follows the surface of the bed and then Ethan. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into something called edit mode. And if I hit tab, we get into edit mode. And you can see we've got all of these little individual dots and all of these triangles that are making up Ethan. Now, when we did our simplification, this actually brought this down so there's less of these triangles and dots. And if we hadn't done that simplification, there'd be loads of them. And your computer might really be struggling at this point, and it could have really struggled with that Boolean. So that's why we do this. So we want to select all of the edge around the outside. And to do that, we need to go into edge mode. We come up here and click edge mode, and we can click on an edge. Now we could very gradually go around and hit this edge and hold down shift and then get the next bit and the next bit and the next bit, but that is going to take forever. So instead we're going to click on one of these edges and we're going to tell Blender to select everything that's similar to this edge. And to do that we hit Shift and G and we want the amount of faces around this edge. So at the moment, if any of these edges that are on the outside has one face, I'm just going to come and click here, that's a face. So we have one face connected to this edge, whereas all of these other edges have two, one either side. So if we click here, Shift and G, and click amount of faces around an edge, we get the whole of the outside of Ethan, or at least the bed, selected. And then if we just come into side view, I can press E and then Z to extrude these down. So we're getting something similar to a plinth. But we need this to be flat on the bottom. So what we're going to do is hit S to scale it again, Z to keep it only on the Z axis, and then we're going to type in 0. And that means scale everything to the same point on the Z axis, which makes this flat. Now at this point, we could probably move this up. This is probably a bit thicker than I want. So I'm just going to hit G and Z to move this up. We're going to need to get to the point where we're not going to leave something like here. That would be a problem. So let's just G and Z and go down to about there. And then finally, we're just going to hit F to fill that in. And now if we hit Tab, we've got a solid object. This is now 3D printable. Now, this is going to look a little bit weird at the side here. That's because Blender tries to make everything look smoother. If we just right click and click Shade Flat, we get a much better view of this. So this is what we're going to end up with. This is what we're going to print. So I'm pretty happy with this. In most instances, this is what you're going to want to do, but we need to sort out Ethan's hair, or basically this curve that's at the back that doesn't look quite right, where we filled in this big hole. And to do that, we can use something called sculpting mode. So to get into sculpting mode, we're just going to come up here and click sculpt mode. And we get all of these options at the bottom of how we can sculpt. Now what we're actually going to do is we're just going to use, because this is sort of being flattened, we need to sort of blow it out like it's a balloon. We're going to do that with this inflate button, and anything we do our mouse over will get inflated out. Now this is going to take forever like this, so what we're going to do is hit F to make this a bit bigger, and we're just going to click. Just drag this out to the point where this looks a bit more correct. Okay, now you can see where I did that initially, it's got a little bit of a lump. If you hold down Shift and click, this will smooth things out. So you can see this really isn't that difficult to get something much more like the correct roundness of his head. So it's just a combination of clicking and then holding Shift and click. And that's going to look fine. We'll do the same thing here. Now this is a bit more extreme. See, especially here, we're going to hold Shift and click that and just sort of go over it. And then just once again, use this brush to just expand everything out. Just blow it up like it's a balloon to get the correct shape of his head. And just come out every so often, have a look. There we go. Cool. There you go. That's looking much better, much more like the shape of his head. There we go. And I'm much more happy with that. Now this is where if you want to really freak someone out like your partner, you could always come in and make him a Klingon if you wanted to. Where's my draw brush? Let's go a bit smaller. We could do something like that. There we go. Okay, and sort of do something freaky. So if you're not scanning your child, you're scanning your friend, this is the time to now really, really mess with them. Anyway, just Control and Z will undo anything you've done if you go too far. And that's sort of more what I wanted to demonstrate here. But yeah, this is looking pretty good. Let's go back to our inflate. And try to get something that matches more the shape of your child's head. There we go. Okay, I think we're pretty good there. If you really do want to try and sculpt in some hair, you can do. Just use that draw brush, as I said, F to make it nice and small. and you could sort of just put in some little extra bits of hair. Just make sure you get your brush small enough that actually it looks like hair. So up to you if you want to do that. I'll leave that relatively smooth. I don't think that's needed. So there we go. Now, if we come back here to object mode, we can, at this point, turn Ethan into a 3D printable file. And most 3D printers use something called an STL file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to File, Export, STL, and we'll call this Ethan Print. And then I'm going to importantly click Selection Only, otherwise it will try to export everything in this file, including that cylinder that we hid earlier. Click Export STL. Then it's just a matter of bringing it into your favourite slicer, getting it sliced and 3D printed. Oh, and waiting to see how long it takes for your wife to notice that you gave your baby a sick finger off camera.